Hello, thank you so much for coming to my talk. It's called Reframing Shame and Embracing Mistakes. My name is Jameson Hampton. I'm a Buffalo native, so I'm really happy to be speaking here again at my favorite conference, especially here at the Transit Drive-In, which has been an important place for me for my entire life. So I'm just here very excited. Feel free to find me on Twitter and to tweet about my talk. I'm Jamie Bash on Twitter. Just please keep in mind if you talk about me publicly on the internet that I use they, them pronouns. So I appreciate you remembering that. I want to get right into it. I'm starting with an exercise. Raise your hand. I know this is a recorded talk, but I am here in person, so I will be looking around to see if people raise their hand. Raise your hand if you've ever introduced a bug into production or caused a production incident. Okay, is everyone doing it? I'm just going to have to trust that you're doing it. This is a talk about shame. And shame is a very powerful emotion. It runs deeper than similar emotions like embarrassment or guilt, which are usually primarily concerned with something that you've done or maybe something that you haven't done, as the case may be. Shame is primarily concerned with who you are, and that allows it to do damage to our self-worth in a much more insidious way. Well, what do I mean by that? Here's the second half of the exercise. Now raise your hand if you lied just now about if you've ever caused an incident, or if you thought about lying, like you weren't sure if you should raise your hand or not. That's because shame makes it hard to admit when we've made mistakes. And that in itself, I think, is a shame because we learn a lot from making mistakes. There's no, it's silly to be embarrassed about it because everyone makes them. In fact, one thing that some of my coworkers say at work when I'm feeling bad about my work is that no one was born knowing this. We all have to learn it as we go along. And that's how we learn a lot of things. Ever since we were kids, we've been trying things, seeing how they work, trying different things, and that's kind of how we learn. A very smart person, in fact, a very wise person once said to me that wisdom is knowledge and understanding and experience, and you need all three of them to really have wisdom about something. So even if you know something and you understand it, if you haven't really experienced it yourself, and a lot of that type of experience comes in the form of making mistakes, then you don't really have wisdom about it yet. I want to talk about a lot of this stuff kind of in terms of tech and work and career as much as I can. So I want to do a case study about an outage that you may remember. GitLab had an outage in January of 2017 that was kind of a thing at the time. I actually wrote this talk before I realized that GitLab was a sponsor of DevOps Days Buffalo. So hello, GitLab. Thank you for sponsoring DevOps Days Buffalo. I'm sorry that I'm going to talk about your outage, but actually the moral of this story that I'll get to is that I think GitLab handled it really well, and so that's why I wanted to do a case study on kind of how they handled it. But I do have to start by setting the scene with what happened for those who don't know. Back in January of 2017, GitLab had about 18 hours of downtime. They lost about 300 gigs of production data that ended up being unrecoverable, which is rough. This was caused by an error that was made by a developer on their team. They called him Team Member 1 in all of their correspondence about the incident, so that's what I'm going to use, although actually this person has come out and admitted who he was, so it's not a secret. But he accidentally removed the primary database directory instead of the secondary, and that's what kind of kicked off all these issues. GitLab did a couple of retros about it, publicly afterwards, which I am going to talk about in way more detail. But I really liked this quote from one of them. At GitLab, we think that the people making the most mistakes frequently correlate with the people doing the most work. And I think that that is very true and wise to say. So I really like that quote. I also remember at the time a lot of people speculating about Team Member 1 getting fired, because when something like this happens, that's what people say. They're oh, who's going to get fired over this? Actually, Team Member 1 got promoted not long after. He had just qualified for a promotion to senior dev based on their career ladder, right before the outage incident, and they ultimately decided that making one mistake didn't change all the other things that he had accomplished, which I totally agree with. In fact, I couldn't find the exact quote, but I very distinctly remember at the time people asking GitLab, who was going to get fired or whatever, and folks from GitLab responding, saying things like, why would we fire him now? He just learned this. He's never going to make that mistake again. Why would we fire him now? Which I thought was very wise, even at the time also. They also had these shirts made for all of their engineers that worked on the incident, which I think are very cute and charming. I really love I'm team member one, because, like, yes, there's one person who, like, pressed a button and then became, like, weirdly famous for this incident. But it's really on the whole team that there were no guardrails in place to prevent someone from making that kind of mistake. And also, it wouldn't have been nearly so bad as it was if they had had viable backups, but they hadn't tested their backup procedure, and, like, that's definitely on the whole team. So I like this idea of, like, succeeding or failing as a team. Talking about mistakes is kind of the second half of this, and it's what I think GitLab did so well. Because, like, it can be hard to admit when we've made a mistake, even though, again, everyone makes them, so someone who claims that they make no mistakes ever just sounds like a big liar. Like, actually taking responsibility for your mistakes, like, reflects well on you in a lot of ways. It normalizes other people making mistakes and admitting to them, and I think this one's really big, particularly if you're a senior developer, because naturally junior devs are more afraid to admit their mistakes and how it's going to reflect on them. And I think it's common for people when they're junior to feel like senior folks don't ever make any mistakes and that they know everything, which obviously isn't true. So I think it's really important for them to see that senior devs also make mistakes, and that's why I feel like it's kind of like our responsibility to, like, talk about it when we make mistakes. It also, like, makes you a good teammate when you take responsibility when you've messed up. It ensures that that doesn't fall on other people on your team. And also, when you're honest, your team can band together faster to resolve mistakes faster, which is what happened with team member one. Like, there were interviews where people talked about this person coming on Slack and being like, oh no, I messed this up. And, like, instead of pointing fingers, everyone was like, okay, what can we do? How can we fix it? Like, what's next? And I respect that a lot. It sounds counterintuitive, but it also, like, inspires confidence in your work because it shows that you know when you are wrong and you're capable of admitting it. So that kind of, like, fosters trust. Of course, all of these things do assume, like, a healthy workplace. Naturally, in an unhealthy workplace, there can be consequences to admitting your mistakes. That's just going to force everyone to, like, adopt unhealthy communication strategies. And so it's really, really important to foster, like, a healthy culture around this on your whole team. Another thing that I remember speculating about when the GitLab outage happened was, like, what was going to happen to GitLab as a company. They were pretty new to the scene at the time, and this kind of outage and data loss is, like, bad in general. It's particularly bad when you host people's repos. And so I honestly thought that this incident was going to kind of kill GitLab completely. And I was bummed about that because even at the time I really liked GitLab. But obviously that's not what happened. They're here and around and sponsoring conferences and doing great stuff in the community. And I think one of the reasons was this postmortem that they put out afterwards. As you can see from this screenshot, it was a 21-minute read, so it was pretty long and extensive. It's one of the best examples of a public postmortem I've ever seen. And I appreciated it for two reasons. First, because it's very enlightening and interesting about, like, everything that happened around this incident, and I learned a lot from it. But also, I think it just sets such a great example for the rest of the industry of how to talk about these things. This is a quote from someone who worked at GitLab at the time in an interview, and they were chatting about how, like, all of the affected customers were also developers, and that kind of changes the dynamic in an interesting way. First of all, developers, I think, are more sympathetic in general to, like, incidents happening that affect them, because, like, we've all been there. We know what it feels like. It feels bad. We've all been there. I actually kind of hope that this, in turn, can make us more sympathetic to ourselves when we're involved in an incident, because, like, again, we know other people have also been there. We've all been there. But also being honest and open about incidents creates a lot of trust. And that's what this postmortem did, I think. It proved that they took the problem seriously. They were being honest about what was going on. And that means that you can trust that they're being honest when they say other things in the future. And they're also taking real steps to happen again, that it won't happen again. And I think that this transparency really kind of was a boon to GitLab in the aftermath of this outage. That said, while there could be a really good talk about how to foster that kind of culture at, like, a company, that's not always something that people can do on the individual level. And this talk is really more about fostering that kind of kindness to yourself. And that's why I'm going to talk about cognitive behavioral therapy. I'm not a psychologist, but I've been personally using CBT myself for a long time for my own anxiety, and I find it really helpful. This is just a basic overview, but I want to talk about some aspects of CBT that I find particularly relevant to imposter syndrome and like anxiety at work. And those are automatic thoughts, feedback loops, cognitive distortions, and cognitive reframing. Automatic thoughts are kind of the basis of CBT. This idea that like we have a lot of thoughts that just kind of happen to us without us really thinking them through. Our brains are just so complex and so practiced at interpreting things around us that they form these really complex thoughts without us having to really do anything. And sometimes that's really great. Like if you don't have to really think a long diatribe about it to know that you should jump out of the way when a car is coming. Like your brain just sees that and interprets it for you. But other times it can be really unhelpful to have thoughts in our heads that are like formed without actual reasoning behind them. You hear the phrase intrusive thoughts a lot. That often refers to like violent thoughts, but it doesn't have to. We're going to talk a lot about cognitive distortions and these like harmful automatic ways of thinking. But like on a basic level, like have you ever just met someone and jumped to a conclusion about them and then it turned out to not be true and you like felt bad about it? Like we can't help having those kinds of thoughts and judgments automatically, even when they don't reflect how we really feel about something, because that's kind of just how our brains are wired to have thoughts. And it's really important to realize how many of the thoughts that we have every day come from like our automatic brain rather than from like our cognitive reasoning. Because that like rolls into feedback loops and how they happen. When you have emotions and then you have thoughts about those emotions, it causes you to have like more emotions. And that's how you get kind of stuck in having negative feelings about something. There's a concept in CBT called the ABC model of emotions. That means that an activating situation triggers a belief or a thought, and that then leads to a consequence or a feeling. The activating situation itself doesn't necessarily carry any emotional weight. Like maybe you're stuck in traffic, that doesn't cause emotional weight. But it causes you to have a thought about if you're going to be late, and then it causes you to have a feeling about like what's going to happen if you're going to be late. So that's like we interpret these thoughts and it leads you to these feelings in kind of an automatic way. I experience this in the form of secondary anxiety, where I have anxiety about the fact that I am already having anxiety, which is really stupid, but I can't make it not do that. So like I get panic attacks sometimes, and if I start to feel anxious, I'll get like, oh, I hope I don't have a panic attack. Oh, I don't want to have a panic attack. And like that kind of anxiety about panic like makes that more likely to come to pass. And it's partially because a lot of bad feelings, particularly anxiety, but a lot of them like cause physical reactions in our bodies, like bad feelings. And this like further reinforces negative feedback loops, because if you feel bad in your body, it's likely to trigger more negative feelings. And cognitive distortions, which I've mentioned a couple times, and it's going to be like the whole last part of this talk, is kind of like a description of like how chain reactions can cause these thoughts to happen. The theory of cognitive distortions was proposed by a psychiatrist named Aaron Beck in the 60s and 70s. And then the common names of the different distortions were popularized in the 80s by one of his students, David Burns, who also said this quote, which I find really insightful and true. And the more you practice these kind of thought patterns, the more entrenched they become in the way you think. And you're practicing them every time you allow yourself to have them without correcting it. Your brain kind of remembers the shapes of your thought patterns and the way you think. So if you're always having these kind of negative thoughts, then naturally it's going to feel natural to have more negative thought patterns in the future. So that's what I mean by practicing. Cognitive reframing is the CBT technique for stopping cognitive distortions, where reframing is just like looking at a situation differently. And this is also the kind of thing that you can practice, because it will become more automatic as you kind of forge those new pathways and have your brain remember those shapes. So the other side of the coin is, if you're always practicing to do positive thought patterns, then it like will come more and more naturally to you to do positive thought patterns. Okay, Jamie, but how do I really practice any of these things? What does that mean? There are some steps you can take. The first one is to notice when you're having cognitive distortions, which also requires practice. If you can't tell when you're having like distorted thinking, then it's impossible to stop from doing it. So this step is really, really important. And the good news is once you're aware of the different types of cognitive distortions, which we're going to go over just after this, then it helps you to recognize when they're happening to you. It's still hard, though. It's important to evaluate the evidence. I like to do this by actually physically writing it down. Try having like a column of evidence that like suggests that your negative thought is like correct, and then another column of evidence that like proves that it's not correct. I find writing stuff down particularly helpful because even when your brain is telling you something very loudly, because brains do have the tendency to do that, you can still look at your physical list and like get information off of it. And you just have to practice having compassion to yourself. I like to think of it in terms of like, how would I feel if someone was treating my friend the way that I'm treating myself right now? This is kind of like that theory that if you fake smiling enough, eventually the act of smiling will like positively influence you. Speaking kindly to yourself is the same. Even if you don't believe the kind things that you're saying at first, like saying them over and over will positively influence your psyche over time. Another thing that's important when you're thinking critically about your thoughts and your feelings is to be able to name those feelings. The feelings wheel, this is probably too small for you to really read. Maybe it's big on the drive-in screen. You might have seen this before. You can look it up. It can be really, really helpful in putting a specific name to the way that you're feeling, which isn't always as easy as it sounds. I have a limited amount of time in my talk, and this is like a really big topic actually, so instead of spending a lot of time diving into it, I want to recommend the best talk that I've ever seen about feelings, which is Hacking Your Emotional API by John Sowers, who's a friend of mine. This is a really good talk. You should really go watch it. But I want to save some time to talk about different cognitive distortions themselves. This is not an exhaustive list. I've chosen some to talk about that I think have particular relevance to negative feelings that are common at work and negative feelings that feed into imposter syndrome. So this is a list, but I'm going to talk about all of these individually. All right, so starting with all or nothing thinking. This is the assumption that there's only two possibilities in a given scenario. There's no room for middle ground. There's no room for mistakes. It's just two. What might this look like at work? I made a mistake today, and my performance review is next week. Now there's no way that I'm going to get a good review. Well, let's try reframing that and see what it looks like to reframe a thought. You know, making a mistake is frustrating, and the timing on this one was particularly frustrating, but I just have to keep doing my best. It's unlikely that a single badly timed mistake is going to ruin my whole performance review. One thing you'll notice in a lot of my reframings is I try to name the feeling. Like I'm going to get a bad review isn't actually an emotion. I'm feeling frustrated is an emotion. And it's helpful to know where you're coming from in that way. Catastrophizing. This is one I do a lot. This is like assuming that it's always going to be the worst case scenario, like extrapolating these horrible things that could come from something small. I caused an incident today. I know I'm going to get fired, I just know it, and then I'm never going to be able to find another job in the industry. All right, let's reframe that. You know, I wouldn't expect to get fired over just a single incident, but for some reason, even if I did, you know, I found this job, and I'm sure I would find another opportunity. Fortune telling, another one I do a lot. Making dramatic predictions about what will happen in the future, and assuming that they're true, is also kind of part of this. For instance, last time I did a deploy, it brought the entire site down. I have to deploy again today. I'm sure it's going to happen again. Try reframing that. Yes, I messed up last time, but I learned a lot from it. Now I'm better prepared not to mess up again. I should just take it one step at a time. When you assume these bad things are going to happen, kind of like I was saying with secondary anxiety, you're more likely to manifest them into happening. So it's good to be able to walk in with a calm attitude about it. Labeling. An overgeneralization that creates a negative judgment about an entire person on a small amount of evidence. Actually, it doesn't have to be a person. Could be like a group of people or a thing or a concept. But in the context of imposter syndrome, I'm kind of assuming that you're going to be labeling things about yourself. And so that's how I'm talking about it in that context here. I overlooked a really obvious bug today. I'm a terrible programmer. Let's reframe that. I made a mistake today and I missed a bug that felt obvious. I'm feeling pretty embarrassed about it. Name the feeling. I'll have to look out for stuff like that next time. Magnifying the negative. This is one I think a lot of people do a lot. Fixating your thoughts so you're focused on only the negative aspects of a situation. It allows negative feelings to become exaggerated. For instance, Jess found 2 typos in my code when she reviewed it. It must seem to her like I wasn't even paying any attention. Try reframing. You know, the rest of my code was good. Really, typos aren't a very serious mistake. Jess caught them in code review, and it didn't end up being a big deal. The counterpart here is minimizing the positive, which sounds kind of the same, but it actually manifests pretty different. This is when we ignore the value or the importance of the positive parts of a situation. But these kind of go hand in hand because when you're so focused on what went wrong, it's very easy to forget about what went right. My manager complimented me on fixing that bug, but it was really easy. Anyone could have done that. She was probably just trying to be nice. Try reframing. I did good today. My contributions are valuable to the team, and my manager wants me to be aware of that. This leads to this kind of very relatable feeling because magnifying the negative and minimizing the positive, again, are 2 sides of the same coin, and that's the coin that causes people to do this, which I think we can all probably understand. Mind reading. This one's a little bit tough because we do think about what other people are thinking and try to figure out what other people are thinking. Like, that's a pretty natural part of communication. But when you read too far into it and you assume that you're right and like act as if you're definitely right, even though you don't really know what other people are thinking, that can be a problem. David left so many comments on my PR. He must think I'm so stupid. Let's reframe. I feel self-conscious about the fact that David had so many suggestions, but he's only trying to help me improve. He's complimented me on my work before. I'm sure he doesn't think I'm stupid. Again, naming the feeling. It's not about what David thinks. It's about the fact that I feel self-conscious. Overgeneralization. Drawing broad conclusions. You see words like always and never, and that's kind of how you know you're doing overgeneralization. Oh no, I got asked to give a demo. That never goes well for me. I always mess it up. Let's reframe. I do get nervous doing demos, and so I have struggled with them in the past. But this time, I have a chance to make sure that I'm totally prepared. Self-blaming. This is a particularly big one, actually. Believing that you're solely responsible for a negative situation, even when there are factors outside your control. A bug I introduced caused our entire app to crash. It's all my fault. Let's reframe. You know, even though I wrote the code that introduced this bug, my coworkers also tested it and approved it, and they didn't catch it either. This isn't all on me. We succeed or fail as a team. I used that phrase earlier when I was talking about team member 1, and that's kind of why I did that whole case study, because I think people do this so much, and that if everyone internalized this idea of succeeding or failing as a team, I think that we could all maybe be a little bit kinder to each other in general. In conclusion, I know I made all of this sound pretty simple, but actually this stuff is really hard. It's hard to even make the decision to examine your thoughts in the way that we just did. I really like cognitive behavioral therapy in that it's simple to understand and learn, and once you understand it, you can start to put it into practice. But changing the way you think and the shapes that your thoughts go, like we talked about, is really hard, and in the process, you're gonna mess it up a bunch of times. But the good news is that it's additive. Just because you messed it up once doesn't mean you're doing a bad job. The more you practice, the better you'll get at it over time. And remember, I'm proud of you. And of all of your mistakes. Everything that you've accomplished, all of the mistakes you've made, and everything that you've learned from them are all part of the you that you are right now. Thank you so much for listening and for coming to my talk. It's really important to me to be able to talk about these kind of things in the tech industry. So thank you to DevOps Days Buffalo for having me. Please feel free to find me online. Again, I'm here. Come find me here. I would love to meet everybody. And thanks again.